They were pouring champagne in the conference room when I walked in. Not for me. They never pour champagne for me anymore. They were pouring it for themselves. My son Devin, his wife Brianna, my grandson Preston, celebrating a deal they believed would transfer 60% of Carter & Sons holdings to a foreign investment group by Friday morning. They had the glasses. They had the smiles. They had the signed letters of intent spread across the mahogany table like playing cards in a winning hand. What they didn't have was my signature. What they didn't know was that without it, every piece of paper on that table was worth exactly nothing. I took my usual seat, the one in the corner by the window, slightly apart from the main table. The chair Brianna had suggested 2 years ago when she reorganized the conference room. More natural light over there, Yvonne. Better for your eyes. I had smiled and moved without argument. People underestimate a woman who moves without argument. They think it means she has nothing left to fight for. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the side table, sat down and watched my family celebrate the sale of something that still belonged entirely to me. My name is Yvonne Carter. I am 63 years old. I built Carter & Sons Holdings from $800 in a pickup truck in 1986, and I have spent the last 3 years allowing the people I love most to believe they had taken it from me. I want to tell you why. But first I need to tell you how it started, because the end only makes sense if you understand what came before it. And what came before it was so slow, so quiet, so perfectly engineered that I almost didn't see it myself. The first time Brianna Elaine Whitmore walked into my son's life, I thought she was exactly what he needed. Devin had always been brilliant and a little lost, the kind of man who was exceptional at following a path once someone laid it out for him, but uncertain when he had to choose the direction himself. He had his father's eyes and his father's laugh, and God rest Marcus's soul. Something of his father's tendency to trust the wrong people when he wanted badly enough to believe in them. After Marcus died in 1995, it was just the two of us. Devin was 8 years old and I was 32, and every decision I made from that point forward, every early morning, every late night, every dollar I didn't spend on myself was for him. Brianna came into his life when he was 34. She was beautiful and sharp and socially graceful in a way that Devin never quite was, and she looked at him like he was worth looking at. I understood the appeal. What I didn't understand yet was that Brianna Elaine Whitmore looked at everything the way a careful person looks at an investment, identifying the value, calculating the return, planning the exit. The changes came slowly, so slowly that I kept telling myself I was imagining things. The Sunday dinners stopped first. Devin and I had dinner together every other Sunday for 11 years. After Marcus died, food became the language we used to stay close. I would cook nothing fancy, just the things he grew up on: smothered chicken and rice, black-eyed peas with ham hock. The cornbread Marcus had always called the best in Georgia, and Devin would sit at my kitchen table and tell me about his week. That was our rhythm. It held us together through his college years, through his 20s, through the grief that never entirely goes away. 6 months after he married Brianna, the Sunday dinners became every third week, then once a month, then holiday only with that particular kind of apology that isn't quite an apology. Mom Brianna puts so much effort into hosting at our place now. It feels redundant to split the weekends. I bought new dishes anyway. I kept the table set for 2. Then the work calls changed. Devin had called me twice a week for years, usually from the car on his way into the office, running through whatever was in front of him: a difficult client, a contract decision, a question about logistics pricing that he already knew the answer to but wanted to think out loud about. I was the person he thought out loud with. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. By the time he'd been married 2 years, the calls came once a week, then once every 2 weeks, then mostly on my birthday and at Christmas, short and cheerful and finished in 11 minutes. When I mentioned a supply chain issue I'd been watching in the quarterly numbers, he said Brianna handles most of the strategic review now, Mom. She's really good at it. I said I know she is baby. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. I am telling you this not to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this so you understand that I am a woman who pays attention. I have been paying attention my entire life to contracts and margins and the thing a person's eyes do when they tell you something that isn't entirely true. I paid attention when Brianna started attending my board meetings and asking questions that sounded like curiosity but landed like territory claims. I paid attention when she suggested gently and repeatedly that I might want to step back from the operational side of things. I paid attention when she hired a new head of HR who happened to be her college roommate, and a new head of marketing who happened to have worked with her first husband. Her first husband. I'll come back to that. For now, I want to tell you what my life looked like from the outside during those years, because there's a particular kind of invisibility that descends on a woman of a certain age, and Brianna understood how to use it like a tool. The corner chair became my whole world, at least as far as anyone could tell. I came into the office every Monday. I wore the same 3 blazers on rotation. I brought a tin of homemade cornbread muffins for the front desk staff because I had done that since 1994, and I saw no reason to stop. I sat at my desk in the secondary office, not the corner office I'd occupied for 22 years, the one Devin now used, the one with the original Carter Logistics sign. I'd hung on the wall the day we moved in, and I looked at spreadsheets and signed what was put in front of me and smiled at people who spoke to me in the particular gentle, loud voice reserved for the elderly and the irrelevant. Preston was the worst of it, though. I don't entirely blame him. He was 28 and ambitious and had grown up watching Brianna perform competence so fluently that he'd come to believe competence looked like her. At a board meeting in February, he stopped mid-presentation to explain to me what a debt-to-equity ratio was. Slowly, with the whiteboard marker uncapped and ready in case I needed a diagram, I let him finish. I thanked him for clarifying. What I did not say was that I had explained debt-to-equity ratios to his father using that same whiteboard in 1994 when Devin was a freshman in college, asking me why we couldn't just borrow more money to expand faster. I had drawn a seesaw. Devin had laughed and said, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." That was one of my favorite afternoons. I did not say any of that to Preston. I just nodded and wrote something in my notebook and watched him recap the marker with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had been helpful. There was the incident with Emma Reyes, our longest-tenured account manager, who pulled me aside after a client call to tell me kindly, genuinely kindly, which almost made it worse that Brianna had suggested I might be more comfortable in a reduced advisory role. She said, "You've been seeming a little overwhelmed lately, Mrs. Carter. That you mentioned it yourself. I had not mentioned anything of the sort to anyone." I smiled at Emma and told her I appreciated her concern. Then there was the December board dinner, the one Brianna organized at Nikolai's roof white tablecloths. 12 people, Devin standing at the head of the table and saying, "This company is the legacy our generation is building together." He looked around the room at all the people he'd thanked by name. Preston Brianna, their director of operations, their financial consultant. He looked at me near the end of the table and said, "And of course, Mom always there for moral support." Moral support. 38 years of my life, and I had become moral support. I applauded with everyone else. I ate my dinner. I took a car service home because I'd given my regular parking spot to the new marketing director 3 months earlier at Brianna's suggestion, because the walk from the far lot would be so much easier on your knees, Yvonne. My knees are fine. I walk 5 miles every morning. I have done it since 1998, and I intend to do it until the day I cannot. But I said nothing. I moved my car. I sat in the corner. I brought the cornbread muffins. I let them look past me. Because here is what nobody in that conference room understood. Not Devin with his champagne glass. Not Brianna with her perfect red dress. Not Preston already daydreaming about what car he'd buy with his cut of the deal. When you spend years looking past someone, you stop watching what they're doing. And while they were looking past me, I was doing quite a lot. I took out my phone under the conference table and sent a 4-word message to my attorney, Theodore Aiken, who had been handling my legal affairs for 22 years, and who was at that exact moment sitting in a different office 3 blocks away with a folder of documents I had spent 18 months preparing. The message said, "Right on schedule, Theodore." He replied with a single word, "Ready." I put my phone away. I finished my coffee. I watched Devin refill Brianna's glass, and the way she smiled at him, that particular practiced warmth. The kind that had fooled everyone in this room for 4 years. And I thought about the woman she'd been before she was Brianna Carter, about what Gloria had found, about what I now knew. But that is a story for a moment when the timing is right. I have learned in 63 years that timing is everything. Let me tell you about the woman I actually am. Not the woman in the corner chair, not the woman with the Tuesday blazer rotation and the cornbread muffin tin, not the woman Preston explained debt-to-equity ratios to as if she had never in her life balanced a ledger. The other one. The one who built something from nothing in a country that gave women like her very little room to build. In 1986, I was 23 years old. Marcus was 25 and working for a freight company in Macon, and driving home on Friday nights smelling like diesel and ambition, and we were broke in the specific way that young couples are broke when they are too proud to admit it and too stubborn to stop dreaming. We had $840 in a joint savings account, a 1-bedroom apartment in southwest Atlanta with a bathroom faucet that dripped, and a second-hand pickup truck that Marcus had named Gerald for reasons I never fully understood. I had an idea. The freight company Marcus worked for was hemorrhaging small contracts, local manufacturers' furniture shops, a lumber yard outside of Conyers because the company didn't want them. Too small. Too much paperwork for too little margin. I watched Marcus come home frustrated 3 Fridays in a row because he'd been told to turn away clients he believed were worth keeping. On the 4th Friday, I said, "What if we kept them ourselves?" He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I said something that scared him a little, because it made too much sense. Then he said, "Baby, we don't have a truck." We had Gerald, I told him, and I had a telephone and a willingness to make calls until someone said yes. Carter Logistics signed its first contract on a Tuesday in March 1986 with a furniture manufacturer in Conyers named Holt & Son, who needed reliable delivery twice a week to 3 retail accounts in Atlanta. The contract was worth $420 a month. I remember the exact figure because I framed the invoice. It is still hanging in my office. Not the corner office. My office, the one I kept after everything changed. The one with the window that faces east, so the morning light comes in clean and clear. The one I go to at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrives. Those first years were not romantic. I want to be honest about that because people hear a story like this and they imagine a kind of noble struggle with clean edges, a woman and her husband and their dream, and the reality was more complicated and more exhausting than any version I could tell in a few minutes. There were months when the money ran so thin that I paid our drivers before I paid our electric bill, and hoped the lights stayed on long enough for me to finish the invoicing. There were clients who didn't take me seriously until I had been delivering for them faithfully for a year, and a few who never took me seriously at all. There were banks that looked at me, a young black woman with a single truck and a business plan handwritten in a composition notebook, and found reasons to say no that had nothing to do with the quality of what I was proposing. I learned to find other ways. I learned to save the no's and study them and come back with something they couldn't refuse. Marcus was my partner in all of it, not just in the work and the belief. He believed in what we were building with a steadiness that helped me through the moments when I wasn't sure I believed in it myself. He handled the driving in those early years while I handled the phones and the billing and the relationships with the clients. And we would sit at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, just the 2 of us with coffee going cold between us, and talk about where we wanted to take it. He had ideas. Good ones. He saw the warehousing expansion before I did. He was the one who first said, "Yvonne, we need to think bigger than the metro." Marcus died 9 years later. He was in his truck when a driver ran a red light on I-20. He was 32 years old. Devin was 8. I was 32, and the morning after the funeral, I lay in bed for exactly 1 hour, telling myself that I could not get up, and then I got up. I want to be clear about this. I do not tell the story of Marcus's death to generate sympathy. I tell it because it is the fact that shaped everything that came after. I had a son who needed a future, a company with 11 employees and a roster of 23 clients, and a grief so large it had its own weather. I chose to let the grief and the work occupy the same space. A therapist later told me that was not the healthiest approach. She was right. It was, however, effective. What I did not do in the months after Marcus died was slow down. I could not afford to slow down, and not primarily in the financial sense, though. That was real. I could not afford to slow down because slowing down would have meant sitting still long enough to feel everything, and I did not yet trust myself to feel everything and still be standing on the other side of it. So I worked. I drove the contracts myself some mornings when a driver called in sick. I made the phone calls. I kept the books. I took Devin to school every morning and picked him up every afternoon and helped him with his homework at the same kitchen table where Marcus and I had planned the company, and I did not let him see me cry until he was in bed. And then I let myself cry for exactly as long as I needed to, and not 1 minute longer. Devin grew up watching all of this. I think it shaped him in ways we are both still understanding. By 1994, Carter Logistics had 47 employees. By 2003, we had expanded into warehousing and last-mile delivery across 5 southeastern states, and a private equity group in Charlotte offered me $12 million to acquire a majority stake. Devin was 20 and home from his first year at Morehouse. He sat across from me at this same kitchen table and said, "Mom, take the money. You can retire. You deserve to rest." I told him I didn't want to rest. I told him the company was worth more than they were offering, and that in 10 years I would prove it. He thought I was being stubborn. He was 20. He didn't yet understand that stubbornness and vision look identical from the outside and completely different from the inside. In 2013, Carter & Sons Holdings had renamed it when Devin joined the business, a gesture of love and inclusion that I have thought about many times in the last 3 years, was valued at $91 million. The Charlotte Group that had offered me $12 million in 2003 reached out again. I thanked them for their continued interest. This is the company that Devin and Brianna were preparing to sell 60% of on a Friday morning in late October. This is what I had spent 38 years building. And this is what I had spent 18 months quietly, carefully, legally protecting. Because 18 months ago, my CFO, Gloria Washington, came to me with a folder of documents and a look on her face that I recognized immediately. It was the look I had worn myself 4 years earlier, the first time I understood what Brianna was actually doing. Gloria Washington had been my chief financial officer for 16 years. She was 61, meticulous, and possessed of a financial instinct so sharp it bordered on uncomfortable, the kind of person who could read a balance sheet the way a doctor reads an X-ray, identifying the fracture before the patient knew anything was wrong. She was also deeply loyal, not in the sentimental way, but in the considered way, the way of someone who has watched a person operate under pressure for a long time and decided they are worth following. Brianna had pushed Devin to let her go 18 months ago. The official reason was a restructuring of the financial department. The real reason was that Gloria had raised questions at a board meeting about a series of consulting contracts that Brianna had approved without standard oversight review. I called Gloria the day after Devin told me she'd been let go. I asked her to meet me for lunch. At the restaurant before our food arrived, she slid a folder across the table to me and said, "Yvonne, I need you to look at something." What she showed me was the beginning of a pattern. Small irregularities, individually explainable, collectively troubling. A consulting firm that had billed Carter & Sons for strategic advisory services over 18 months, with invoices signed off by Brianna, whose principal the incorporation records in Delaware listed as a woman named Sandra Elaine Hargrove. Sandra Elaine Hargrove was Brianna's mother's maiden name cousin. That was problem 1. Problem 2 came 6 weeks later after I had quietly re-engaged Gloria as an independent financial consultant, paying her from a personal account, telling no one. Gloria spent those 6 weeks doing what she does best. What she brought me on a Wednesday afternoon in my kitchen was considerably worse than a questionable consulting contract. Brianna Elaine Whitmore had been married before, not to someone who had died, not a brief youthful mistake quietly annulled. She had been married for 3 years to a man named Douglas Earl Pittman, a 61-year-old real estate developer in Charlotte, North Carolina, who had met Brianna when she was 32. They had married quickly. Within 8 months of the wedding, Douglas Pittman's adult children from his first marriage had filed a lawsuit alleging that their father's new wife was systematically transferring assets out of jointly held accounts and into entities she controlled. The lawsuit took 2 years to resolve. Douglas Pittman emerged from the marriage with significantly less than he'd entered it with, and a quiet agreement that both parties would refrain from making public statements about the other. Brianna Elaine Whitmore had done this before. She had found a successful man with grown children who resented any claim on their inheritance. She had made herself indispensable. She had used the family's internal tensions to position herself as the rational center, the practical one, the person who just wanted what was best for everyone. She had isolated him from the people who knew him before her, and when the time was right, she had moved. Devin was not Douglas Pittman, but the architecture was the same. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because I think it matters. I am not saying Brianna was evil. I am not saying she woke up every morning with destruction as her intention. What I am saying is that she had developed over years, and perhaps out of genuine necessity at some point in her life, a set of strategies for acquiring security, and those strategies required a particular kind of target. Someone successful, someone trusting, someone whose family relationships had natural tensions she could widen with very little effort because those tensions already existed. Every family has fault lines. That is not a shameful thing. It is simply true. The fault line between Devin and Rochelle had always been about attention, Rochelle the younger who had fought harder for her place, and therefore understood its value more clearly. The fault line between Devin and me had always been about independence, a son who loved his mother deeply, and also somewhere underneath that love, needed to believe that what he had built was his own. Brianna had not created those fault lines. She had simply found them, measured them, and applied pressure at exactly the right points over a long enough period of time that nobody noticed the ground shifting until it already had. She had done the same thing to Douglas Pittman, and the man Gloria's investigator had found before that a widower in Memphis with grown children and a mid-sized construction company and a disposition toward trust that his own family later described as his greatest quality and his greatest vulnerability. He had not filed a lawsuit. He had simply become quieter, more isolated, more dependent on Brianna's version of events than on his own memory of them. By the time he understood what was happening, too much had already been transferred, too many relationships had already been severed, and the cost of fighting it felt greater than the cost of letting it go. I was not going to let it go. I sat with that information for 3 days before I called Theodore Aiken. Theodore had been my attorney since 2001 when a vendor dispute had required someone who could be both precise and unmovable, and a colleague had described Theodore as exactly that. He was 67 now, semi-retired, and handled my personal legal matters exclusively, which meant Brianna had no professional relationship with him and no reason to consider him a factor. I told Theodore everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. He listens like information is scarce, and attention is the only currency that matters. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you want to let this run?" I told him long enough for them to believe they've already won. What Theodore and I built over the following 18 months was not complicated. Complexity is a liability. It requires maintenance, and maintenance requires trust in people who might not hold. What we built was simple and structurally sound. A holding entity, the Yvonne M. Carter Family Trust, into which the actual controlling shares of Carter and Sons Holdings were transferred through a series of legitimate, properly filed, entirely unremarkable legal transactions. The transfers were disclosed in the required filings. They were visible to anyone who looked carefully at the right documents in the right sequence. Nobody looked. Why would they? I was the woman in the corner chair. I was moral support. The 60% that Devin and Brianna believed they were selling to their investment partners was 60% of something they did not control. The transaction they were planning would require my signature as trustee. They had not asked me for it because they did not know they needed it. By the time they understood what the documents in that folder actually said, I intended to be in the room. I want to tell you one more thing about those 18 months because I think it matters. I was not cold during that time. I cried on a Thursday night in February, sitting on the edge of my bed, because I had found a photograph of Devin at 7 years old, standing in front of Gerald, the truck, wearing a hard hat, 3 sizes too large, and grinning like he had invented happiness. I called my pastor, James Reed, at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, and asked him to pray with me not for victory, but for clarity, because I needed to be sure that what I was doing was right, and not simply what I wanted. I made mistakes and second-guessed myself, and sometimes sat in my kitchen at 4 in the morning, wondering whether what I was building was justice, or just a more sophisticated version of the same thing being done to me. I decided it was not. I decided this carefully over many months, and I stand by it. But it cost something. I want you to know that it cost something. Every relationship that matters costs something, and the ones worth keeping cost the most. The meeting was called for a Thursday. Brianna framed it as a family conversation, her phrase delivered through Devin, who texted me 4 days in advance with the particular formality he had adopted in recent years when delivering messages that came from his wife. "Mom, we'd like to get together Thursday evening. Family conversation about some planning stuff. Brianna's place, 7 o'clock. Planning stuff. Rochelle drove me. My daughter Devin's younger sister by 4 years, who had her father's stubbornness and my mother's capacity for direct speech, picked me up at 6:30 and spent the drive telling me what she thought of the whole arrangement with a frankness that would have embarrassed her brother and did not embarrass me at all. "I don't trust that woman, Mom," she said, navigating the I-85 interchange with the focused irritation of someone who has strong feelings about both family politics and Atlanta traffic. "I haven't trusted her since the Christmas she reorganized your kitchen when you were at church, and then acted like she'd done you a favor. I told her I knew. She gave me a look. I gave her one back. We have had this conversation wordless total since she was 14 years old. Brianna's living room had been arranged for the occasion. There were bottles of sparkling water and a cheese board that suggested effort and hospitality. There were also 2 men I didn't recognize who introduced themselves as attorneys, sharp-faced men in good suits, who stood slightly back from the family seating as if they were waiting to be deployed. Devin sat beside Brianna on the sectional sofa. He had the look he sometimes got in difficult situations, a kind of effortful pleasantness. A man holding a shape he wasn't entirely comfortable inside. Preston was in the armchair by the window performing a casualness that didn't reach his eyes. Rochelle sat beside me on the love seat, close enough that our shoulders touched. Brianna opened. She was good at openings. She had a gift for entering difficult conversations through the side door, approaching the subject at an angle that made it seem like concern rather than acquisition. She spoke for several minutes about family legacy, about the importance of planning ahead, about how much she and Devin had been thinking about what was best for everyone. She said everyone 4 times. I counted. Then she said we've had some concerns as a family about the level of stress that operational responsibilities are placing on Yvonne. She did not say Mom. Brianna had never called me Mom. That had always told me something. "We've spoken with some specialists," she continued, and based on some things we've observed over the past year, some confusion about meeting schedules, some difficulty with complex documents, we think it might be time to formalize a transition of certain responsibilities. She placed a document on the coffee table between us and slid it toward me. I did not pick it up. I knew what it was. A legal instrument designed to transfer my role from principal to figurehead, to reclassify my ownership in language that would make future challenges difficult and my ongoing consent unnecessary. Dressed up as care, presented as protection. Confusion about meeting schedules. I had not been confused about a meeting schedule in my adult life. I arrived early to everything. I had arrived early to my own wedding. Rochelle made a sound beside me. Not a word, just a sound the kind that precedes words that would not be helpful. I put my hand briefly on her knee. She stopped. I looked at Devin. He was looking at the coffee table. That was the moment. Not the document. Not Brianna's careful language. Not the attorneys standing at the edges of the room like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence I had never agreed to write. The moment was my son looking at the coffee table. I had sat across from Devin in difficult moments for 38 years. When he failed his junior year chemistry class and was too ashamed to tell me. When the company lost its largest client in 2009 and he called me at midnight not knowing what to do. When Marcus died and Devin stood in the hospital corridor and looked at me with eyes that said, "What do we do now?" And I had taken his face in both my hands and said, "We keep going, baby, that's what we do." In every one of those moments, whatever else was happening, Devin had looked at me. Now he was looking at the table. I want to tell you what that silence felt like because I think it is important to be honest about this part. It did not feel like betrayal exactly, though it was that. It felt more like losing something I had been trying not to admit was already gone, the way you feel when the last leaf falls from a tree you have been watching go bare for weeks, and you realize that somewhere along the way you stopped waiting for it to stay green. There is a specific kind of grief for things that leave slowly. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes the new shape of the room you're standing in. I sat with that feeling for exactly 3 seconds. I know it was 3 seconds because I counted. That is a thing I do when I need to hold myself steady. I count. 1, 2, 3, and then I move. Rochelle's shoulder was pressed against mine. I could feel her wanting to speak. I kept my hand on her knee, and I did not move it. Brianna was still talking. Something about the challenges of the transition period, about the support systems she and Devin had researched, about how this was being done out of love. Love. That word coming from that mouth in that room. I waited until she finished. Then I reached into my bag. I took out a pen and the small yellow legal notepad I carry everywhere, the one that has lived in my bag since 1994. I wrote 2 words. I folded the page precisely in half. I put it in the side pocket of my bag where it would stay until I needed to remember what this moment had required of me. The 2 words were 38 years. That was what I owed myself the right to remember. Not the anger, not the grief. Just the fact of the time and what had been built with it and what that meant. I stood up. "Thank you," I said to Brianna, and I kept my voice entirely level, the way I have kept my voice level through client negotiations and bank refusals and every other conversation in my adult life where being calm was the only power I had available to me. "Thank you for your concern." Then I looked at my son. I looked directly at him, and I held it until he raised his eyes, which took a moment, but he did. And in his face I saw what I had been looking for, and dreading in equal measure. He knew it was wrong. Somewhere underneath everything Brianna had built around him, Devin Carter knew that what was happening in that room was wrong. He just hadn't found his way to saying so yet. I said I'll be in touch. Rochelle drove us home in a silence that said everything she had been storing since the cheese board. When we turned onto my street, she said, "Mom, tell me you have a plan." I told her to come inside. I told her I would make us some tea. She said, "That means yes." It meant yes. On my way out of Brianna's house, I passed the young woman at the front door, Brianna's personal assistant, a quiet girl named Kelsey, who had worked for Brianna for 2 years and always looked faintly apologetic about it. I stopped. I said good evening. Then, very calmly, I recited from memory the direct dial numbers of all 4 senior partners at Harrison Capital Group, the investment firm that Brianna and Devin believed had no existing relationship with me. Kelsey stared at me. Please let Mrs. Carter know I said that I remember the numbers that matter. Then I walked to Rochelle's car and got in, and we drove home and I made the tea and I told my daughter what came next. The 7 days between that Thursday evening and the Friday morning of the signing were the longest and the quietest of my life since the week after Marcus died. I say quiet because from the outside nothing looked different. I came into the office Monday morning with my cornbread muffin tin. I sat at my corner desk. I signed the documents that were put in front of me. I responded to emails in the measured, slightly delayed way I had cultivated over 2 years as part of the impression that I moved a little slower than I once had. Inside, I was moving very fast indeed. Monday. Theodore met me at 7 in the morning before his office opened at the kitchen table of his house in Decatur, the same table where we had sat 19 months ago when I first laid out everything Gloria had found, and he had listened and then asked me how long I wanted to let it run. He had coffee waiting. He had the documents waiting too, 3 sets organized by category flagged with the colored tabs he'd used since the 1990s. Red for action required, blue for informational, yellow for timing dependent. Everything on the table was red. I read through each set carefully, which Theodore expected, and which is why he had made a full pot. When I finished, I signed where indicated. The structure that had taken 18 months to build the holding entity, the transfer documentation, the trustee designations became fully operative with those signatures. Everything that mattered, everything that was real, was now formally and unambiguously mine, in a way that no document Brianna's attorneys had prepared could touch. Theodore collected the papers with the care of a man who understood what they represented. Then he looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup and said, "The investment group sent their final pre-signing confirmation this morning. They've agreed to the revised terms." I said all of them. He said every line. Harrison Capital Group had spent 8 months negotiating with me in complete secrecy for the right to acquire a stake in Carter & Sons Holdings at terms significantly more favorable to the company than anything Devin and Brianna had arranged with their own contacts. Harrison was not a stranger to me. I had met their managing partner, Arthur Baines, at a logistics industry conference in 2019. We had kept in touch. When I called him 14 months ago and asked for a confidential conversation, he had agreed without hesitation. Arthur Baines was, in my experience, the kind of businessman who preferred to deal with the person who actually owned something over the people who merely believed they did. Tuesday. I called Rochelle in the morning. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. "Are you ready?" she said. I told her to be at my house Thursday night. I told her to bring her overnight bag. I told her I needed her to be present for something on Friday morning in an official capacity as a shareholder. She was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said, "how long have you been planning this?" I told her long enough. Then Rochelle, who had her father's directness and had never in her life said less than she meant, said, "I need you to promise me something. When this is over, when all of it is over, you'll give him a real chance. Not a performance of a chance. A real one." I told her I already knew what I was going to offer him. I told her that was the part that had taken me the longest to work out, not the legal structure, not the financial terms, but exactly what I was prepared to give my son, and under exactly what conditions and why. She said, "Okay, just that. Okay." That was the most important conversation of the 7 days. Wednesday. While I was having breakfast at 6:15 in the morning and reading the quarterly report, Gloria had sent a clean, complete version of the numbers. Not the summary Brianna's team had been presenting to the board. Devin was at the gym. Brianna had enrolled them both in 3 years ago. While I was on the phone with Arthur Baines, walking through the final logistics of Friday morning, where his team would sit the order in which the documents would be presented, The one specific moment I needed him to wait for before responding to anything Brianna's attorney said. Preston was shopping online for a car he did not yet own, calculating how to afford it on the basis of a deal that had not yet closed, and as it would turn out, never would on the terms he was expecting. I found myself unable to be angry about that. I found myself instead remembering being 32 years old and looking at the Carter Logistics balance sheet after our first full year of operation and thinking, now we can breathe. The optimism of believing something is real before it has fully arrived. I understood it. I had simply learned over 38 years what it cost when the ground turned out not to be as solid as it looked. Wednesday evening, Preston called Rochelle at 11 o'clock at night. He had found something in the pre-signing documents. A trustee designation on one of the core holding documents that pointed to an entity he hadn't seen before, an entity whose name meant nothing to him, but whose legal weight, once he understood it, changed everything about what Friday was going to look like. He was confused. He was also frightened, though he hadn't said so in those words. He had said something doesn't add up. Brianna's attorney called back 30 minutes after she got off the phone with Preston. The call lasted 8 minutes. The attorney's conclusion delivered with the careful neutrality of someone managing bad news. The designation was valid, the entity was legitimate, and if the named trustee did not appear on Friday morning and voluntarily execute the transaction, the deal had no legal foundation whatsoever. Brianna did not sleep that night. I know this because I did not sleep that night either, but for different reasons. I sat in my kitchen until 3 in the morning, not thinking about Friday, but thinking about Devin at 7 years old in a hard hat, 3 sizes too large, grinning in front of Gerald the truck like he had never in his life been handed something he didn't deserve. I thought about a specific afternoon in 1996, the year after Marcus died. Devin was 9. He had come home from school with a permission slip for a field trip to the zoo, and there was a line at the bottom that said parent or guardian signature, and he stood at the kitchen counter with the pen in his hand for a long time before he said, "Do I put your name or Dad's?" And I had sat down next to him and taken the pen from his hand and said, "You put mine, baby. That's whose name goes there now." And he had looked at me with those eyes, Marcus's eyes, the ones that took everything in and held it and said, okay. And then he had gone to do his homework, and I had sat at that counter for a while alone, letting myself feel the full weight of what that simple question had cost both of us. That was the boy who had been in that conference room on Thursday looking at the coffee table, while someone used words like confusion and burden to describe his mother. I was not angry at him sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning. I want to be clear about that because I think it is the part of this story that is hardest to explain. I was not angry. I was grieving, which is a different thing, and I had learned a long time ago that grief and anger can look identical from the outside while being entirely different on the inside. Anger wants to destroy the thing that caused the pain. Grief wants to understand it. And what I was doing in those quiet hours was understanding what had been lost between my son and me, how it had been lost, and what it would take to find our way back to each other on the other side of what was coming. I thought about what I owed him, not as his adversary, as his mother. Thursday night, Rochelle came over with a bag of groceries and cooked dinner without being asked her way of showing up, when showing up is what is needed. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about small things, her daughter's school play, a neighbor's new dog, the way the oak tree in the yard had held its leaves later than usual this year. We did not talk about Friday. We did not need to. Rochelle had been present for every important thing I had done in my adult life, and she knew the shape of me when I was ready, and she understood that what I needed that evening was not strategy, but company. She left at 9. I washed the dishes. I laid out the ivory suit on the chair in my bedroom the way my mother used to lay out her church clothes the night before Sunday morning. Then I went to bed and I slept for 4 hours clean and without dreaming, and I got up at 6 and walked my 5 miles, and I came home and put on the suit. Friday. Rochelle drove me downtown. She did not offer commentary on my appearance, which meant she thought I looked right. Rochelle's silence on the subject of appearance is always the highest compliment. She parked in the garage and we rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and she stood beside me in the corridor outside the conference room for a moment before I opened the door. "You ready?" she said. I straightened the cuff of my left sleeve. The gold chain at my throat, Marcus's gift the year we signed our first contract, settled against my collarbone where it always settled. "I've been ready for 18 months, I said. She opened the door for me. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something enters that changes the weight of the air. Devin was standing near the window holding a coffee cup talking to one of Brianna's junior attorneys. He turned at the sound of the door. His expression passed through 3 things in rapid sequence: surprise, confusion, and something more complicated that I chose not to interpret too quickly. Brianna was seated at the table. She was wearing a red dress and the expression she wore when she had already decided how a meeting would go. When she saw me, the expression did not change, which told me she was working harder than she appeared to be. Preston was beside her. He looked like a man who had not slept and had spent the sleepless hours rearranging furniture in a house he was beginning to understand did not have the foundation he had assumed. He looked at me when I walked in. Then he looked at the folder I was carrying. Then he looked back at me. Arthur Baines and 2 members of his team were seated on the far side of the table. Arthur had the stillness of a man who has sat in many rooms where money and intention were being sorted from one another. He inclined his head slightly when I walked in. I returned it. Theodore came in behind me and took the seat to my left. I set my folder on the table. I did not rush. I opened it with the same deliberate pace I use for everything: meetings, conversations, decisions that cannot be undone, because I learned a long time ago that the person who controls the speed of a room controls a great deal else besides. I placed a document in front of every person seated at the table. Arthur and his team, Brianna's attorneys, Devin, Preston, and lastly Brianna herself. Brianna looked down at the page. I watched her read the header. I watched her read the entity name. I watched her get to the trustee designation and stop. Theodore stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in the quiet, precise voice of a man who has practiced law for 40 years and knows when to let words carry their full weight without assistance. "I'd like to formally introduce the principal party to this transaction, Yvonne M. Carter, sole trustee of the Yvonne M. Carter Family Trust, which holds 73% of the voting shares of Carter & Sons Holdings. Any transaction involving those shares requires her authorization. No such authorization has been provided to date." The room was very still. I looked at my son. Devin was still holding his coffee cup, though he had forgotten it was in his hand. He was reading the document slowly, the way a person reads something they understand intellectually, but cannot yet make fit the shape of what they believed. I watched his face move through the information: the entity name, the share percentage, the date of filing 18 months ago, publicly recorded, discoverable by anyone who had thought to look for it. He looked up. We held each other's gaze across the table, and there was a long moment in which everything between us was present simultaneously: the kitchen in 1994, the phone calls in the early mornings, the debt-to-equity seesaw drawn on a whiteboard, the Sunday dinners that had slowly become nothing, the conference room in December with the champagne and the phrase "moral support the Thursday evening," and the coffee table, and his eyes looking down. All of it. 38 years of everything we were to each other, and what had been done to it, and what still remained underneath. Then I spoke. "You spent 3 years learning to look past me," I said. "I used that time well. Now who wants to sit down and do some actual work?" Brianna stood up. "This is not legally." "It is legally," Theodore said, still with that patient precision, and laid 3 additional documents in front of her attorney before she could finish. "I'd encourage you to review the exhibits. Take whatever time you need." Preston, who had been silent since I walked in, who had spent the last 17 hours in the particular private crisis of a person whose assumptions have been systematically dismantled, did something I did not expect and will not forget. He looked at Brianna, then he looked at me. Then he said to no one in particular, but in a voice clear enough for the whole room, "She built this company." Just that. 4 words. He said them the way a person says something they have known for a long time but are saying out loud for the first time, because they finally understand that it needs to be said. Brianna turned to look at him. Something shifted in her expression, the specific recalibration of a person who understands that a piece they had counted on has moved. Arthur Baines had not spoken yet. He had been reading the documents with the thorough, unhurried attention of a man for whom the discovery of the actual owner of an asset is not an obstacle, but a clarification. Now he looked at me, and there was something in his expression that I recognized as professional respect, not performed, just registered the way you acknowledge someone who has done careful work well. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "perhaps we could take 15 minutes and then continue this conversation with the correct parties at the table." "I think that's exactly right," I said. Brianna's attorneys gathered their documents. One of them leaned close to her and spoke quietly. She listened with the perfect surface composure of someone who had trained themselves never to show a room what they were actually feeling. I knew that composure. I had worn it myself for 3 years. It is exhausting work, and it leaves marks you don't see until later. She walked out of the conference room without looking at Devin. He stood at the window for a moment after she left. Then he set down his coffee cup still full, and he came to the table, and he sat down across from me. He didn't say anything right away. I let him have the silence. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and stripped of the careful confidence he had been wearing for years like a coat someone else had chosen for him. "How long?" he said. 18 months of building," I said. 3 years of watching before that. He absorbed this. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked back at me. "The corner chair," he said. "The corner chair," I said. He pressed his hands flat on the table. A gesture I recognized, something he had done since childhood, when he was organizing his thoughts and didn't want to lose any of them. Then he said, "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." I told him I had not stopped being honest with him a single day of his life, even when it would have been easier to be otherwise. "Did you know," he said slowly, "that she had done this before? The other marriage, before you started all of this?" I told him yes. I told him when I had found out, and how and what it had meant for the timeline of everything else. He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know," he said finally. Not defensively, just as a fact set down on the table between us, like something he needed to put down in order to look at it clearly. "I know you didn't," I said. "She told me things about you. Things He stopped. "I should have called you and asked you directly instead of just accepting what she told me." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I did not soften it. He needed to hear it without softening. That was what respect required. "I'm sorry, Mom." He said it quietly without performance, the way you say something when you mean it too much to dress it up. I stood up. I put my hand on his face the way I had in the hospital corridor the night Marcus died when he was 8 years old and the world had ended, and I had told him we were going to keep going. "I know you are," I said. "Now let's get to work." I gave them 48 hours, not as a punishment. The 48 hours were designed to give everyone enough distance from the Friday morning to make decisions that came from something more durable than shock. For Devin, a return to the company in a real operational role, not ceremonial, not reduced. A restructured board that included Rochelle, who had been excluded from meaningful participation for 3 years, and Gloria Washington reinstated as CFO, effective immediately. A 12-month review period at the end of which, if Devin had demonstrated the judgment and independence the role required, I would begin a formal transfer of an additional 20% of voting shares. His permanently. One condition stated plainly, Brianna Elaine Whitmore would hold no position formal or informal in the management or strategic direction of Carter & Sons Holdings. This was not negotiable, and I did not present it as though it were. Devin read the proposal at my kitchen table on Saturday morning. He read it twice. He asked 3 questions, all of them about the operational details rather than the personal terms, which told me he was thinking like a businessman rather than a wounded son. That was what the situation required and what I had hoped for. His first question was about Gloria's reporting structure, whether she would report to the board or directly to him. I told him to the board with full transparency to him as CEO. He nodded. His second question was about the timeline for the share transfer, whether the 12 months was fixed or whether there were conditions that could extend it. I told him it was fixed and that the conditions were performance-based and written into the document he was holding, and that he should read them carefully. He said he already had. His third question surprised me. He asked whether Rochelle's seat on the board was permanent or provisional. Permanent, I said. He nodded again, slowly. The way he nods when he is not just agreeing but filing something away. He was quiet for a while after that. Outside the kitchen window, the November light was coming through the oak tree Marcus had planted the year Devon was born, the one I had thought about cutting down a dozen times and never could bring myself to remove. The light fell across the table between us in a way that made the morning feel briefly like it belonged to another time, like we were back in 1997, just the two of us. The company still young enough that the whole future was still uncertain and therefore still entirely possible. She told me you weren't capable anymore, Devon said. Not loudly, just quietly, the way you say the thing you have been carrying and finally need to put down. She told me that you were making decisions that didn't make sense, that you were confused in meetings that the staff were covering for you because they didn't know how to tell me. And He stopped. I waited. I believed her, he said. I believed her because it was easier than the alternative, because the alternative meant that the person I had chosen to build my life with was not who I thought she was, and I didn't want that to be true, so I let myself believe the easier version instead. I know, I said. That's not an excuse. No, I said. It isn't. He looked at the table. Then he looked at me. I've been thinking about something you used to say when I was a kid. When I was wrong about something, and I knew it, and I was trying to get around admitting it. You used to say the truth doesn't get smaller because you look away from it. I remembered saying that. I had said it about homework mostly, about the chemistry class he failed, about the time he took money from my purse when he was 12 and denied it for 3 days before coming to me at 11 o'clock at night and telling me the truth. The truth doesn't get smaller because you look away from it. I had not known saying it to a 12-year-old about a few dollars, that I was also saying something that would take him another 25 years to fully understand. I'm going to need time, he said. You have it, I said. That's what the 12 months are for. He nodded. He signed the proposal. He stood at my kitchen table for a moment looking the way he used to look when he was 8 and had done something he was ashamed of and was trying to find his way back to being the person he knew himself to be. I'm sorry, Mom, he said very quietly, without performance. I know you are, I said. Now let's get to work. For Preston. He came to my door Saturday afternoon alone without calling ahead. He sat across from me, and he did not make excuses. He said I should have thought for myself instead of following whoever seemed most certain. I didn't do that, and I need to do better. I told him he was right. I told him he had also said 4 words in a conference room on a Friday morning that I would not forget. He looked slightly embarrassed. I just said what was true. That's all anything requires, I said. For Brianna, I did not make her a proposal. There was nothing to propose because there was nothing she had been promised that was legitimately mine to offer. I will say this, and I mean it without performance. I do not know what Brianna Elaine Whitmore was trying to build for herself. I know what she took from Douglas Pittman. I know what she tried to take from my son and from me. I also know that somewhere along the way, she had learned that the only way to hold what you needed was to take it from people who were not watching carefully enough. I was watching. That was the difference. I hope she finds another way. I am not naive enough to believe that she will, but I hope it the way you hope things for people you will never see again, without expectation and without malice, and with the quiet understanding that some people are not yours to save. 3 weeks after the real signing, the one with Arthur Baines and the correct documents and the correct principal at the table, A plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded at the edges, the way photographs from the mid-90s fade when they have been kept in a drawer rather than an album. It showed a woman and a small boy standing in front of a pickup truck. The woman was 32 years old and wearing a blazer that was too large for her because she had bought it from a second-hand store for a client meeting, and it was the best she could find in her size that week. The boy was 8 years old and wearing a hard hat so large it had slipped down over one ear, and he was grinning with his whole face in the way that children grin when they are too happy to be self-conscious about it. On the back, in handwriting I had known since second grade, I remember this day. I'm sorry I forgot what it meant. Devin. I stood at my kitchen counter and held that photograph for a long time. Then I put it in the inside pocket of my blazer, the same pocket where I had carried Gloria's report, where I had carried the folded page with 2 words written on it, where I had carried for 38 years whatever needed to be kept close to the chest. I put on my coat. I walked out the front door. I did my 5 miles in the November morning, the same 5 miles I have done since 1998, past the same houses and the same oak trees, and the same slow turn of the seasons that have always made Atlanta feel to me like a place that knows how to hold things without letting them go. When I got home, I poured my coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop and pulled up the quarterly numbers that Gloria had sent the night before, and I began. They spent 3 years learning to look past me. I used that time well. Now, before I go, I want to say something directly to you, to the person listening to this right now. People have asked me why I waited, why I spent 3 years in a corner chair when I could have confronted the situation much sooner. The honest answer is that I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I acted. Not just the legal situation, not just the financial structure, but the human reality of it, what had happened to my son, what had been done to the space between us, what it would take to rebuild something real from what remained. A woman who acts from anger moves fast and breaks things. A woman who acts from clarity moves at exactly the right speed and leaves the door open for what comes next. I have been angry, privately, genuinely, thoroughly angry in ways I did not show anyone, except maybe God late at night when the kitchen was quiet and the weight of it was the heaviest. That anger was real, and it was valid, and I do not apologize for having felt it. But I did not lead with it. I led with patience, with preparation, with the understanding that the most powerful thing a person can do when someone has decided they are no longer worth watching is to use that invisibility wisely. There is a particular kind of woman who has spent her life being the one who holds things together, who remembers the birthdays, who makes the calls, who builds the thing quietly, and then steps back so others can take credit for standing near it. Many of you listening to this are that woman. You have been underestimated. You have been spoken over and worked around and thanked in the same breath as being dismissed. I know what it feels like to sit in the corner chair. I know what it feels like to watch your own life get reorganized around you, your parking spot, your office, your seat at the table, your name in the stories people tell about things you built. I know what it feels like to have someone look through you in a room you have occupied for decades, to hear your own accomplishments described as background noise, to be told with genuine seeming warmth that you are loved and respected at exactly the same moment you are being set aside. I know what it feels like to wonder in the quiet of 4 a.m. whether you have already lost. The feeling lies. Not about the pain is real and it deserves to be felt fully, because if you skip the feeling of it, you will carry it somewhere else where it will do more damage. But the feeling lies about what the pain means. Being pushed aside does not mean you have become less than you were. Being excluded does not mean you have lost your value. Being underestimated is not a verdict. It is a miscalculation made by someone who has not done their homework about who you actually are. Every hour they spent not watching me was an hour I spent preparing. Every meeting I was excluded from was a meeting where I was not required to pretend everything was fine. Every time someone explained something to me slowly with that particular gentleness reserved for people they believed could no longer follow complex ideas, I sat with the knowledge that I understood it better than they did, and I used that knowledge in exactly the way it needed to be used. The invisibility they gave me was the most useful gift they could have offered. They just didn't know that when they were handing it over. I want to say one more thing before I finish, because I think it is the thing that matters most, more than the legal strategy, more than the patience, more than the preparation. The reason I did not simply protect the company and walk away from my son is that I never stopped believing he was worth fighting for. Not fighting against, fighting for. There is a version of this story where I conclude that Devin chose Brianna over me, and I accept that conclusion, and I protect what is mine, and I let him go. I thought about that version. I sat with it. I understood its logic. But I raised that boy. I was there the morning he learned to walk in the apartment in Southwest Atlanta with the dripping faucet, and I was there the afternoon his father died, and I was there every morning in between that mattered. I know who he is underneath the choices he made in those 4 years. I know the person he was before Brianna found the fault lines, and I know the person he is capable of becoming because I have watched him be that person. And the memory of it does not go away just because it has been a while. That is not sentiment. That is information, and I acted on it. Devin Carter is not yet the man he is going to be. He is 38 years old, and he has made significant mistakes, and he has work to do, and he knows it. But he is my son, and he came to my kitchen on a Saturday morning, and he signed his name on a proposal that required him to earn his place from the beginning. And the look on his face when he did it was the look of someone who understands, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, what it means to build something real. That is enough. That is more than enough. I want to leave you with this. You have built things. Real things. Things that would not exist without you. And if someone has spent the last year or the last decade looking past you, cataloging your limits instead of your capabilities, deciding your story is essentially over, they are wrong. Not almost wrong. Completely, fundamentally, demonstrably wrong. Being overlooked is not the same as being powerless. The people who stopped seeing you did not make you smaller. They only made themselves blind. And blindness in the end is never the advantage it looks like from the inside. The moment they stop watching you, that is not your defeat. That is your opportunity. Use it.